Hello, today we will be talking about the affirmative action in America, its transformative history, the AA Supreme Court cases, and debunking the misconceptions that have become apparent in our current society. Before we dive in, let's ask the question, what is affirmative action? Affirmative action is a policy that was put into place in order to level the playing field for those who had or have been discriminated due to race, gender, sexual identity, disability, ethnic origin, and age. Let's get a brief background of affirmative action to truly understand the transformative pathway it has set for many Americans. Before you are the first major efforts made by presidents to affirm affirmative action into American society. First, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy made Executive Order 10925 that he said would take affirmative action that there would be equal employment opportunity in the United States. The late president's efforts resulted in the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee that is still used in our governmental processes today. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued another executive order which now allowed for persons in a minority group to be protected under affirmative action. The Department of Labor was also required to be in compliance with this order. In 1967, President Johnson amended his executive order to include women to show good faith to all discriminated groups. Finally, in 1973, President Nixon signed into action the Rehabilitation Act, which would extend to those Americans with disabilities. This act would also build and lead to the 1990 signing of the Americans with Disability Act and the 1991 signing of the Civil Rights Act by President Bush Sr. Affirmative action paved the way for these two vital acts. Affirmative action in the Supreme Court. There have been many cases regarding affirmative action that have made their way to the Supreme Court, many of which have been white Americans concerned with their college acceptances to universities, or Americans of color who are simply trying to fight for their fair chance. Here are a few precedent Supreme Court cases. In 1987, the Supreme Court case Johnson v. Transportation Agency established that race or sex can be used when there is underrepresentation of both. In 2013, Abigail Fisher sued the University of Texas at Austin because she was denied admission into the university. She thought it was because of affirmative action and that it was unconstitutional. The question in this specific case was, does the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment permit the consideration of race in undergraduate admissions decisions according to OAS? Yes, but only under the standard of strict judicial scrutiny. The policy must meet a certain level of judicial scrutiny in order for race to become a factor. This did not work out for Fisher. She simply did not make the cut. Moving into current and ongoing cases. Currently, these two cases, SFFA versus Harvard and SFFA versus UNC, have been heard at the Supreme Court and are under deliberation from the justices. The SFFA is suing these two universities because they believe that the school's consideration for race in their application process violates Title IX and part of the Constitution. Most would think that these two cases would seem pretty open and closed. However, since Harvard is a private university, there are other challenges that can come with the decision. Since it is a privatized university, this means that Harvard can play by its own rules to a certain extent, just as a private corporation can. As the UNC case goes, since it is a public university, they are covered by the 14th Amendment to guarantee equal protection. Now on to our misconceptions. Misconception 1, we no longer need affirmative action in our society. Misconception 2, white workers will lose out on job and career opportunities. Misconception number 3, affirmative action was only created for those in minority communities. Moving into conception 1, we no longer need affirmative action in our society. We as Americans would like to think that we have come a long way since the days that some Americans would have to fight for basic human rights. Unfortunately, we haven't quite squashed out those of us who still believe in racism and oppressing people of color, which is why affirmative action is such an important part of our history in our country. Without affirmative action, the amount of African American students in colleges would drop below 2%, resulting in the access of higher education being cut off almost completely. We will always need affirmative action in our society. Moving into conception number 2. White workers will lose out on job and career opportunities. According to the University of Florida, African Americans continue to have twice the unemployment rate as white Americans. Even if unemployed African Americans took the jobs of white Americans, only 2% of the white population would be affected. Honestly, if they aren't affected, why should it bother the white Americans? Let other people have a chance to become the best that they can be and have a leg up in our society. Also, please make note that affirmative action only protects a person when they are qualified for the position or job. It doesn't just automatically happen. Our final misconception. Affirmative action was only created for those in minority communities. This misconception has been very popular lately as Supreme Court cases come into light and the media exploits minority community for views. Yes, minority people are protected by affirmative action, but like we saw earlier, so are many other groups of people. Affirmative action is for those groups who have faced racial, age, disableist, and sexist discrimination. The so-called playing field is not equal. And yes, it does need to change, but for now, affirmative action allows these Americans a leg up and hopefully one day to be equal. Thank you for watching. For further information, please click the link below to the U.S. Department of Labor.